UConn wants the Big 12. Brett Yormark wants UConn. But will these talks get past the Big 12 presidents and athletic directors?
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Monday, and welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are your co-hosts. I'm Andy Patton. He is Isaac Shade over there, and you're joining us at the place to get your college basketball content every single day, 5 days a week, 52 weeks out of the year, coming to you here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Wanted to thank all of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. Give a special shout out to those everyday listeners and those of you who have joined us on our Locked On College Basketball Discord channel. There is a link in the show notes on both audio and video platforms. If you haven't done so yet, it's free to join. We're hanging out talking college hoops 24/7. Today's episode of Locked On College Basketball is brought to you by Ultimate College Football Head Coach. It's a brand new mobile game that is completely free, has no ads, and is 100% playable offline. Use promo code LOCKEDONCFB, all caps, inside the game store to receive a free boost to your program. Begin your coaching legacy today. Isaac, it is a Big East-centric show today. We had a handful of updates around the Big East Conference. We're going to talk about the UConn and Big 12 conversations that have happened, what is still yet to be done, where they're at in that conversation. It's obviously a potential huge storyline in all of college athletics if UConn does, in fact, leave to go to the Big 12. We'll talk about that. We're also going to talk about Creighton landing a potential starter in late August. That's not something you see all the time, although it is something we're seeing a little bit more in college basketball with teams adding players from Europe late in the offseason. We're going to close out the show talk about Villanova's keep your coach with their job non-conference schedule. It came out on Friday, not a particularly competitive schedule for them. We'll talk about what that means for Neptune and Nova. But Isaac, let's start with the big storyline over the weekend. UConn, Big 12, the talks are back. We saw this reported from a handful of places. Ross Dellinger at Yahoo reported it. Pete Thamel at ESPN also reported it as well. The latest update is that the UConn athletic director and board chair have met with Big 12 athletic directors in Dallas, and that there is a call planned for this week with the Big 12 presidents to potentially lay out the specifics of UConn moving into the Big 12 conference. It is a bit of a different situation than we've seen with other conference realignment setups. Isaac, why don't you kind of give a little bit of an insight into what is being talked about here with regards to UConn's football program and kind of how they're projecting this might shake out between these two sides here?
Yeah, I mean, Andy, this is wild to think about just because of taking the back-to-back national champion and the possibility of placing them into what we believe to be the best conference in college basketball. We'll get to all of that in a second because, Andy, the issue is that this is probably a little bit premature to assume. You and I have been using the language together of how far down the tracks this train actually is right now. I think it's maybe not quite as far gone from the station as maybe some folks have been making it out to seem this week. In fact, per ESPN, a Big 12 official said that, quote, premature is the word used. Quote, there's a far distance between conversations and anything that would happen. The presidents haven't seen the case yet. Andy, that alone is a big deal right there. And what's interesting, we kind of saw this with like SMU joining the ACC, where they basically said, hey, we're going to be all right because we got all the Dallas money, speaking of Dallas. So we're not going to take all your money for a while. We're just going to come in. And it's kind of like that with UConn, where it sounds like if they came into the Big 12, specifically, I'm thinking back to Dellinger's report here, that there wouldn't be all the money yet. In fact, let me just quote Dellinger, who says, while the Huskies are not expected to receive a full distribution share from the league, the move would increase their financial situation and pair the school's elite basketball program with a power conference brand. And by the way, I should say elite basketball programs, because those ladies put the men to shame, if we're being honest, for a long time here. Now, you talked about the football program. Basically, folks, what would happen is all sports other than football under this proposal would join the Big 12 as, soon as 2026. So not next year, but the year after. Of course, as we've seen, Andy, in all this realignment that's happened the last several years, things change, right? Like, was it Texas and Oklahoma that it moved up? It would actually, I think initially supposed to be next year. Obviously, that's happening now. But then, Andy, another half decade before football would join the Big 12 in 2031.
Yeah, basically my read here is that they found a proposal that they think will work. There's a proposal between UConn and the Big 12, and they initially kind of talked about it before it went to the ADs, before it went to the presidents, that they think might entice the people who vote on conference realignment, which again is the presidents and the athletic directors. They think that they have a proposal that might entice them because it's not going to financially impact the institutions right away, because they're adding non-football schools or non-football programs for 5 years. The football comes in 2031. The hope with that plan is that UConn then has 5 years to effectively recruit at a Big 12 level, throw more money towards their football program to get them to a point. Because right now they would not be a competitive team in the Big 12. The Big 12 is not the SEC or the Big 10 from a football perspective, but it is a much better conference top to bottom than the way that UConn has been as a football program independently for a while. So the hope is that we give UConn a half decade to figure out how to make their football program better. We add them at that point when then those institutions in the Big 12 might be more willing to take a slight financial hit by bringing that program in. And I understand why that appeals to UConn. Certainly, they just want to get into a power conference. They're fine waiting on the football side. They want their basketball to compete against Kansas and Baylor and Arizona and Iowa State week in and week out. I get why it appeals to the Big 12, but this basically all my read is that all that they have come up with so far is an agreement that they think might work. That's it. That's not that far down the tracks. And like we said, we have high-ranking Big 12 officials who are saying the word premature to the media. Like they don't want to imply that this thing has gotten very far. And I come from a slightly different perspective as somebody who also covers Gonzaga on a daily basis. Gonzaga they got farther than this, about this far, and things just stalled. And this happened almost exactly 1 year ago. It was August of 2023. Suddenly, Brett Yormark and Gonzaga were talking again. There was big rumors that this was going to happen. The Big 12 presidents and ADs said, hey, we want to wait until we get these 4 new schools from the Pac-12 in. We don't want to make any decisions right now. Obviously, there is a difference between Gonzaga and UConn in the sense that UConn is certainly back-to-back national championships is a much bigger deal. They also do have a football program. So I'm not saying the situations are exactly comparable. I'm just saying that we're not very far down the process here, and it got shut down the last time a team somewhat similar to UConn tried to get into the Big 12. And just because Brett Yormark's really excited about UConn and really wants to make it happen, he felt the same about Gonzaga, and it got shut down quickly. So I do think that there's a lot of steps that still need to be cleared in order for this to potentially happen. If it did happen, obviously UConn joining this conference with these kind of successful programs from a basketball perspective is incredible. It's a huge bummer for the Big East, who has watched UConn continue to try to walk away from them over the last 25 or so years. It's something that keeps happening, but it is an incredible situation for the Big 12. I just think that any kind of thought about how quickly this might happen, we're still a lot of really big steps away from any real movement here.
And if you want to keep up on that, folks, obviously we'll talk about it, but our friend Drake Toll does a great job on Locked On Big 12. Make sure you check out all his conversations. He's been killing the realignment game, Andy.
Yeah.
I'm with you. This would be brutal for the Big East, man. I mean, just a killer in a lot of ways. And I know a lot of people are probably saying, but I thought football was the biggest factor in all this realignment because of the money and everything that goes with it. But folks, let's remember that Commissioner Yormark, I think it was probably in the context of all the Gonzaga conversations last year, he said, and you, Andy, as people that cover college basketball, was really grateful for hearing him say basically, but why can't basketball and why shouldn't basketball be a bigger consideration in all this movement? And I think this is another indication that he truly and firmly believes that, because he's saying like, look, football can wait. We want the basketball entities of UConn in our conference, because what I've been thinking about this over the weekend, Andy, is that this is kind of future-proofing for UConn, sure, but for the Big 12, because we believe that the Big 12 is already the best basketball conference. Yormark is working to make sure it stays that way. This says to me he's got an eye on today and is the visionary that has an eye a decade, 2 decades into the future as well. And Andy, I kind of hate for another conference to catch strays here, but that's why the Big 12 still exists today and the Pac-12 does not. There was a time not too long ago where we thought that the Big 12 might have been on the ropes. Commissioner Yormark, in my opinion, has done a phenomenal job of making sure that the Big 12 says, not only are we not going away, we are now going to thrive. So we'll keep our eyes on this. As we learn more, we'll share it and we'll talk about it and unpack it all together. Now, as Andy said earlier, it's not just a UConn conversation today. It is a whole Big East conversation. At least for now, UConn's still in it. But Greg McDermott and Creighton might have just added a starting small forward in late August, a trend we've seen in college hoops a little more lately in the last couple years. We'll talk about that in just a second. Hey, Locked On College basketball fans. Andy and I want to take a moment to give you a heads up on a brand new mobile game that we think you're going to love. It's called the Ultimate College Football Head Coach. It's an amazing simulation in which you get to step into the shoes of a head coach and lead your football program to glory. Can you imagine actually being the head coach of your favorite team? From recruiting players and hiring coaching staff to overseeing training camps, dealing with scholarships, all that. You control every crucial detail of your program. Can you handle that pressure? Well, here's what we really love about this game. You're responsible for calling the offensive plays, so your strategy will not only determine the success of your season, but will shape the future and legacy of your football program. Ultimate College Football Head Coach is completely free. It's got no ads and is 100% playable offline, so you can play on the go whenever and however you want. And of course, we got a special offer for all you great Locked On College basketball fans. Use promo code LOCKEDONCFB, all caps, inside the game store to receive a free boost for your program. Take advantage of that. To download the game, just visit ultimate-cfb.com or look it up in any of the app stores. Ultimate College Football Head Coach. Begin your coaching legacy today. For a lot of schools around the country, classes started last week. And yet, Andy, here we are, Monday, August 26th, and we learned that Creighton has added a potential starter literally at the beginning of the school year in Fedor Zugic, a 6'6" wing from Montenegro, which, oh, by the way, I've heard Montenegro is awesome. So maybe we should go visit and do like a bio backstory on it. Anyway, Zugic at the FIBA U20 Euro Championships this summer, 18 points a game, 3.1 boards, and 3 assists, Andy, from a 6'6" wing. Love that. Maybe I'd like to see a little more rebounding, but I do like the assists and how that balances. But 18 points, my guy. From Coach McDermott, he says, quote, "I'm excited to have Fedor at Creighton. He brings a level of talent and enthusiasm that will help us succeed." Andy, obviously Creighton has lost Trey Alexander, and they've lost, I can see it, Baylor Shireman. But my goodness, they get back some other dudes. Adding Zugic, what do you think about this late August edition?
Yeah, it kind of fits right in the spot that I think Creighton's biggest maybe hole on the roster. It is kind of that Shireman replacement because, again, when you kind of talk about the teams that are you have the most excitement about heading into next year, typically they have a combination of returners at key positions. They have a combination of incoming, like high upside young players, whether they're freshmen or international players, or even just like young developmental pieces coming through their system. And then you kind of supplement some of those other key spots with transfers. Creighton really kind of fits that bill. And I think the main question before the addition of Zugic was kind of the depth, particularly on the wing. And this really kind of clears that up for them in a big way. I mean, this is a team that they get Stephen Ashworth back at the point guard position. They get most importantly, Ryan Kalkbrenner back at the center position, a guy who's very clearly in the conversation as an All-American, could win his fourth Big East Defensive Player of the Year award this season. Like, he's an absolute monster in the front court. So you add him, you keep Stephen Ashworth, you keep Mason Miller at the 4 spot, and you got to replace Alexander and Shireman, and you replace Trey Alexander with Pop Isaacs. transfer coming in from Texas Tech, a guy who I think is going to fit McDermott's system perfectly. And then your small forward spot, the penciled in starter was Jemiah Neal, a transfer from Arizona State, who's a quality player, was a double-digit scorer at Arizona State. And now you add Zugic, and those two guys feel like they're going to compete for that starting spot. And whoever wins the spot, you're still in a much better spot if you're Creighton because you have some more depth at that position. You have the ability to go bigger and play Neal and Zugic together along with one of Isaacs or Ashworth, and then that way your lineup's a little bit bigger. You could play a smaller lineup and play one of those guys at the 4 if they felt comfortable with it. There's just a lot more versatility, a lot more depth on this roster, a lot more upside. Again, this is a team that was 355th in Division I basketball last year in terms of depth. 355th. In other words, they're in the top, they're bottom 10 in all of college basketball. So they add some depth. Zugic comes in as part of a 4-person 2024 recruiting class alongside a top 40 prospect in Jackson McAndrew, a top 55, top 60 prospect, 56th actually, Larry Johnson, 4-star shooting guard. They get Ty Davis, friend of the program, was on the show
Johnson.
a while back. Sorry, what?
Larry Johnson.
I know, right? UNLV superstar Larry Johnson coming back. I like this addition for Creighton. I haven't seen a ton of Zugic. I don't know a ton about his game other than what we've been able to read, but he fits a positional need for Creighton. And anytime you can add a player who's capable of playing rotation minutes for a team most expect to be in the top 15, maybe even the top 10, you can add him in late August, you got to be feeling pretty darn good if you're Coach McDermott and the Blue Jays right now.
Absolutely. And Andy, I think you're spot on. Like literally some teams, there's like a lot of question marks about the starting lineup. Literally every Creighton projected starting lineup I've seen, and I think as you and I have looked at this roster too, we've assumed prior to this, Ashworth, Isaacs, Miller, Kalkbrenner, and Jemiah Neal. And I think you're spot on that this really kind of, it at least challenges the Neal versus Zugic of it. And look, if I'm a coach, I love that. I love forcing more competition. I'm not saying that Neal or any other starter would have been content and not played hard, but I think this does. It goes a long way to helping making sure that we're pushing each other further in practices. And my goodness, for a team that, as you said, was 355th last year in depth, I think that Coach McDermott is not going to be upset about that in any way.
Yeah, and I think too, I think Zugic he's just getting here. Like you said, classes have already started at some places. Anytime you're getting to a school in late August or September or anything like that, the expectation that you're immediately playing big minutes, like you'd have to be really, really good. And I'm not saying that Zugic is not. He may very well be somebody who can step in and immediately score 20 points in his first game in a Creighton uniform, start all season long, and be a lottery pick. That's the best high-end outcome. I'm not saying that's likely, but it is possible. But also, if he's not ready to step into playing college basketball right away, if he's not ready to play a big role because he's adjusting to whether it's a language barrier or just a system barrier, whether like all that stuff, he's a little bit older, he's 20-year-old, so that does help him. But I think the fact that they have a potential starting 5 that doesn't include him is important because he can come off the bench right away. They have the depth that he doesn't even have to play huge minutes right away. I think he probably ends up playing a pretty big role right out of the chutes because he's just really talented. Yeah. And again, the small forward position was one of the kind of weaker spots on the roster depth-wise. But it's nice that they have enough talent there that they don't need him to play 30 minutes a game. If he can give them 30 minutes a game, great. Awesome. If he's better than Jemiah Neal and he can give you that role and you can move Neal around to different spots and potentially kind of adjust your lineups based on personnel, that is amazing. But if he's not ready to do that, especially in the first part of the season, fine. Maybe he doesn't play big minutes in some of your first really good non-conference games, but by the time you get into Big East play, if he's contributing, you're in a really good spot. And I think that's what makes this so important for Creighton is that they can add a player who has the upside to be a really, really big-time contributor while not necessarily needing him to fill that role. I think that puts him in a position where, he's going to be competitive and he's going to be challenging for spots right away, but there is a little bit of a kind of assurance there that it's not necessarily a ton of pressure right away on a kid who just got to campus right as the school year starting.
And I think I'd also add, Andy, just the chemistry component of it, of like, you've already had all these summer practices, you've already been diving in together. And, I know you're always competing for spots and you got to beat dudes out and you got to, not be a pansy about it. But there is something to team chemistry. And you always do worry about how this affects a locker room. I think quickly of the movie Miracle, I often compare it to this where it's the USA hockey team when they beat the USSR, that whole thing in the Olympics. And Coach Brooks brought in a guy late who had been playing really well in college that year to come be part of the team. And ultimately the guy said, Coach, we don't want him because we're already a family, basically. And obviously that we're not going that far here, but just to say they've had all this time together. I think Coach McDermott and the staff's just going to have to be careful how they bring him along and what his role will be. And as you said, I think it's so great that it seems like they don't necessarily need him, and that allows them a longer leash to, if he's showing that he's the dude deserving of a starting spot, well, guess what? By the time Big East play rolls around, we'll have that figured out.
Yep. Well, speaking of Big East play, Kyle Neptune, he knows that he needs to be 500 or probably a fair bit above 500 if he wants to keep his job after a couple of not so great first seasons at Villanova. His best bet to do so, and what they have done, is schedule as many cupcakes as they possibly can in the non-conference schedule. We're going to talk about that in just a second. But first, folks, let's talk about 5-hour energy, because just about every single day after lunch, I feel tired. It's that afternoon lull. And if you're like me, good news, you're not alone. In fact, research shows that more than 70% of us hit a wall after lunch. So let a 5-hour energy shot help you leap over that wall instead of crashing into it. I've been working on cutting sugar out as I get older, and so I love that 5-hour energy has 0 sugar. Plus, it's got a convenient portable size and is the perfect pick-me-up for getting stuff done in the afternoon. The 5-hour energy website has flavors galore: watermelon, tropical burst, grape, berry, and more. You can try them all. On the site, you even have the option to build your own 12 or 24 pack. You choose the flavors and it's delivered right to your door. So just go to 5hourenergy.com and get some 5-hour energy product today. You can use promo code LOCKEDONCFB to receive 20% off your order. Offer is only valid until September 30th on one order and cannot be used with other promotions. The code is not good on subscription orders. So go to 5hourenergy.com today. All right, Isaac, closing out the show, continuing our Big East conversation. We talked UConn in the first segment and their talks with the Big 12 Conference. We talked Creighton in the second segment, their addition of Fedor Zugic and what it means for that program. Now we're going to close out the show talking about Villanova. They released their non-conference schedule on Friday. We're in the middle of that season where teams are finally releasing their entire full non-conference schedules. We've been trying to talk about some of those high major teams here on the show and kind of looking at the vast differences between how certain teams like Duke and Gonzaga and others put together their non-conference schedule compared to how some other teams put together their non-conference schedules. And while we've kind of spent a fair amount of time dunking on some Big 12 programs in particular that don't schedule very competitive non-conference slates, it's time we do the same with the Big East team here, because Villanova did not put together a particularly competitive non-conference slate last year. Obviously, another disappointing season for Kyle Neptune and the Cats. They did have success in the non-conference, in particular in the Bahamas in the Battle for Atlantis. They won that event. That was a huge kind of, oh, hey, they're moving in the right direction potentially. And things really didn't go all that well for them after that. And this year, they're not even really putting themselves in a position to look all that great coming out of the non-conference slate. I think we talk about, there's not a lot of potential losses on this calendar, but there's not a lot of great wins either. Only three power conference teams that they are officially playing in the non-conference. Those 3 teams are Virginia, Maryland, and Cincinnati. Not great. Yeah. Virginia made the NCAA tournament last year, albeit barely, and albeit showing up in an incredibly poor way in that play-in game. Cincinnati was a good team, but not a great team. We'll see how they look in year 2. Maryland is, a decent team as well, but I don't think a needle mover in a significant way for them. They have some other games that aren't bad. They're at St. Joe's, part of the Big 5 schedule. They often play those teams out in that area. But outside of that, it's a lot of, they're playing Columbia, they're playing NJIT, Lafayette College, Robert Morris. Isaac, what do you make of this set schedule and this situation for Villanova, knowing that there's probably not a hotter seat in college basketball, at least at the high major level, than Kyle Neptune's?
Yeah, I mean, Andy, it's similar to what I looked at a couple weeks ago with Indiana's, where, as you said, this to me is very obvious. We're trying to keep Kyle Neptune's job intact. It's weird, though, because in this analytical age, I think people are finally to the point of not being fooled by what a record says and are finding easy ways to get into seeing how strong a record is or isn't. So, for example, Andy, I went back and looked at last year. Per KenPom, Villanova's non-conference strength of schedule last year was 50. Andy, as we look at this one, it will not sniff that. Like you mentioned that. So the first week of games, by the way, for those watching on YouTube, you can see the schedule pulled up here. But in the first week, Villanova plays 3 games, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, against Lafayette, Columbia, and NJIT. But Andy, so it's like, oh man, that's tough, those 3 games. Well, those teams finished 318, 232, and 335 at KenPom last year. There are no worries for Villanova. And that's 3 of your 11 non-con games right there, right out of the gate. And so I just look at this thing. Obviously, every year they've got baked in the Big 5 Classic of it all. So they've got St. Joe's in that. They've got who else are they playing in that? And right? And so neither of those are great teams. I mean, they're better than those first 3. And then they'll either play in the final of the Big 5 Classic, either Drexel, LaSalle, or Temple. None of those are really moving the needle all that much either. And there's no MTE this year. Last year, they won that battle for Atlantis, as you talked about, and that was probably the high point of the whole season. And so, Andy, you look at this, and it's like, it's so clear and apparent that this is a job-saving maneuver to me.
Is there any record other than undefeated that would be like I mean, like that seems extreme, but like if they so Virginia, Maryland, Cincinnati, those are the high major opponents. With respect to the mid-major teams that they're playing, I don't think there's a loss on this calendar. At St. Joe's is probably the best non-power conference loss that they could take, because it's a true road game against a decent St. Joe's program. But nobody's going to sit here and tell you that, oh, Villanova's in fine shape if they lose at St. Joe's. That's a bad loss. There's just no other way to look at it. So you look at the 3 high major teams. I think the only one that I would say has the potential to be an okay, I don't know, maybe they're all okay losses, but you lose to Villanova you lose to Virginia on a neutral site in Baltimore. Like that's maybe going to be passable if that Virginia team takes a step forward with, if TJ Power pops, if Day-Day Ames and Warley and those guys kind of, lead that program back to some success. Maryland, it's a neutral site in Newark. That's okay. Cincinnati
I think Cincinnati is the best team in the non-con.
Yeah, I think Cincinnati is probably the best loss that they could take. But I don't see any situation where if Villanova has 2 losses in the non-conference, any 2 losses, doesn't matter what they are, it's hard for me to feel enthusiastic about that. And if you're putting your team in a position where you have to win almost all of your non-conference games to even really, and part of this is because Kyle Neptune hasn't earned like a lot, because the last 2 years haven't gone well. So there's an element of that baked into this as well. But like, I don't look at the schedule and see any reality where I'm feeling enthusiastic about Villanova unless they're undefeated or they only have 1 loss and they've been like blowing out teams. And it just means your margin for error is just really, really thin.
Yeah. And so like, Andy, I'm looking at, because for those who are unaware, Bart Torvik already has 2025 stuff up on his site, and you can look at the kind of his odds. And obviously it's a wide open metric right now, but he actually has St. Joe's favored right now and Maryland favored, but Nova is favored in the other 9, and obviously a lot of those by a lot of points. The Virginia, it's a very tight margin, and Cincinnati is a very tight margin. And so, according to Torvik's stuff, he's looking at Villanova coming out of non-con play at 9-2. But Andy, I think I'm with you. You got to take care. I feel like the 8 non-power conference teams, no excuse. You have to win those. I think you have to go 2-1 against Virginia, Maryland, and Cincinnati. That's the goal for me. You can lose 1. I'm great with that, to any of them. But you got to go 2-1. And again, it's not, in some ways, it's just not fair to Kyle Neptune, because we're all comparing him to the heights of the Jay Wright era. And I get that, but that's the bed that we're lying in. And so you got to be okay with it. So, Andy, and again, we'll see. You know, maybe the combo of Wooga Poplar and Eric Dixon is just ridiculous and insane, and we never have to think about this. But man, this schedule isn't doing them any favors.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the last point I'll make here is like the Big East is not the Big 12 in terms of depth. And obviously part of the Big 12's depth is the fact that they collectively schedule fairly easy non-conferences, boost their metrics in the net rankings, and then play each other. And that's been the criticism of the Big 12, specifically from Brad Brownell at Clemson. That was kind of what he brought up. But with the Big East, like, yeah, you get a St. John's team that I think is going to be good. You get obviously UConn and Marquette and Creighton, but like you're also going to play a fair amount of teams that are not going to move the needle all that much from a metrics perspective. DePaul, Georgetown, Butler, Providence is going to be decent, but you know, we'll see where they kind of end up. Like Seton Hall, same kind of situation. Like unless the Big East is dramatically improved from last year depth wise, like dramatically improved. I think DePaul will be better. I think Georgetown will be better, but how much better? You're setting yourself up to have quite a few conference games that aren't particularly needle moving from a metrics perspective, and you already have a bunch of them in the non-conference. Again, it just feels like Villanova has set up their schedule this year to have a very small margin of error in a year where your coach really needs to find himself in the NCAA tournament. And I would be a little uneasy. I mean, maybe Villanova fans aren't uneasy because if the season goes bad and Neptune's gone, then Neptune's gone and you move on from there. But I don't think I'd feel great if I was coach looking at the schedule and feeling like, oh, I don't have a lot of losses I can take and still put myself in a position to succeed.
Yeah, Andy, that's a great point. I haven't really talked to any of the Villanova fan base to get a sense of how they're feeling. Like, would you rather just move on and find somebody else? I'd be really curious to hear from some Villanova folks about that. All right, gang, that's it for today's episode. Kicking off a brand new week of Locked On College Basketball. College football is up and going. Ho, Florida State, what happened to you? And that means that we are so very few weeks away from the tip-off of college basketball. If you haven't subscribed to our show to make sure you're getting ready for the season, do so on YouTube and on your favorite podcast audio platform. If you're not part of our Locked On College Basketball Discord community, we would love to have you there. It's absolutely free to join, and the link for that is in the show notes. Come on in, baby. The water's fine. As always, apologies to the lawyer family. Let's go Wildcats. You know which ones that means today. Seriously, college basketball is better when Villanova's good. We want you to do well, Villanova. Do it, baby. Let's go. We'll talk again tomorrow, but until then, peace.